Hi everyone. This is my presentation on unapologetic and the process of language subordination and discrimination from the book by Lippy Green, English with an Accent. I believe it's chapter 5 that discusses language subordination. And then obviously our book that we read for this week, Unapologetic, a Black, Queer, and Feminist Mandate for Radical Movements. I want to begin with defining literacy. A lot of us might say that literacy is a child's ability to read, write, or comprehend. I feel like that's a very common um, thought that comes to mind when we hear literacy. I'll be using Guy's definition, which is someone's ability to control their secondary discourse. So, what is a primary and secondary discourse? The primary is acquired language from a home or community that you live and grow up in. And a very important part of this is that primary discourses are almost always acquired and not learned. When you're surrounded in this environment every day growing up, you're just soaking up the language and the discourse of your family or friends in the community that you're in. Secondary discourse is the language that you learn outside of home in different social contexts like school, work, and different settings. To kind of understand this, I think about how I would greet my mom versus one of my teachers or my coworkers or a significant other. So those are all secondary discourses that play in with your primary discourse. Um, so Lippy Green's book or chapter 5 opens with the purpose of a myth is to validate an existing social order, which is from a quote by Anne Oakley. Before you go on in this, I want you to think about how do you interpret this quote in the context of your understanding of what standard American English is. So, standard American English, whatever comes to mind when you hear that, whether it's, proper grammar or just speaking well and enunciating your words, like whatever it is when you grow up and hear that. I'm going to be using Lippy Green's example of standard American English. She writes, almost all linguists agree that there is no recognizable standard dialect, and no dialect is better or worse than another. It's commonly interpreted as a language spoken by the educated. I think one of the places where standard American English is most emphasized is in schools. And I'll be talking about that a little later. But think about how you talk with your friends versus in school. You're always prompted to speak well, whatever well is. That kind of plays into our new questions to consider, which is who decided this standard and why do we follow it really without question? And how does the American education system play into the idea of standardization of language? And, I have a typo. Could language neutrality be uniting? So when I say that, I'm thinking, could the total deletion of like a secondary discourse be uniting and everyone speaking whatever the standard is set as for your primary discourse? So standard American English and anti-blackness. Charlene Cruther's definition on page 26 in Unapologetic, she writes, anti-blackness is a system of beliefs and practices that attack, erode, and limit the humanity of black people. Lippy Green's definition of the standard language ideology is the promotion of the needs and interests of dominant groups or classes at the expense of marginalized groups. So standard language ideology is the idea that standard English is the most respected dialect of English, and that kind of just ignores secondary or primary discourses learned by families of marginalized groups. So like Black communities, Hispanic communities, they go to school. These kids go to school and have to learn standard, and they're told that their standard language, that their primary discourse is not right and it's wrong, and that they need to learn this new standard English that might not make sense to them. So identify how Cruther's definition and examples of anti-Blackness relates to the standard language ideology. That's one of my bigger discussion questions. I think there's a lot that we can identify in Unapologetic that Carruthers talks about, like spirit murder of Black children and the crushing of their imagination when they're forced to assimilate and go to these schools where they're told their language is inferior. So Libby Green's process of language subordination. So she outlines this 8-step kind of process that schools go through, which it could be anywhere, but I'm focusing on schools. So language is mystified, and they give an example. You can never hope to comprehend the difficulties and complexities of your mother tongue. So, for example, I worked with refugees, and they came to America, I helped them in an English learning class. And sometimes you can notice the main teacher kind of demeaning their language and saying you need to learn English and speak like this because you'll never understand your own without being there. Authorities claimed, and in the context of a school, I guess this would be teachers and administration, talk like experts. And when, children listen to their teachers and they look to them for guidance, so that authority is already established. Misinformation is generated, so just lies that their language is inaccurate, inferior, and not recognized in the US. And targeted language trivialized, so people make fun of how people talk and different slang. And then conformers and non-conformers are either positive examples and lifted up or marginalized. So being like, hey, look at this person who looks like you or is the same race as you. If they can do it, you can. And then same thing with someone that may not be able to speak, whatever that authority is saying is the standard, calling them arrogant, unknowing, and non-complicit. And then the last two, explicit promises are made and threats are made. This is a big part, especially in Unapologetic. Carruthers speaks about examples: you don't speak English well enough to get a job, or employers will take you more seriously if you speak English rather than with an accent. And Unapologetic on page 27, she quotes Sadia Hartman's work, highlights how the violence of Black people experience doesn't require consent or reason. I think this process of language subordination is extremely important to the idea of language discrimination, because it isn't something that requires consent or reason. It's just this dominant thing that is controlling in our education system. So my two biggest discussion questions for this are: describe how language subordination intersects with anti-Blackness in schools. Especially think about authority, standardization, and conforming and conformers. And then on page 21, Carruthers states that the circumstances we face today are largely the result of decades of decisions to solidify the control of the government by a ruling class. She also talks about big Black organizations setting the standard. So how does your understanding now of the process of language subordination make sense of this quote, considering the emphasis on standardization and SAE in the education system? And that is all I have. I will attach the PDF of Lippy Green's piece. Thank you.